Good morning, everyone. And I'm heartbroken that I can't be at the KLI in person. But I'm immensely grateful to Barbara and Lynn and the other organizers for involving me in the symposium and for giving me this chance to share my reflections for the bicentennial. So I've given my talk the title, The Gregor Johann of History and the Mendel of Faith. That's a slightly cheeky title, and I think with this talk, we begin the critical reflections that Gerd has invited us to engage in, because as some of you will recognize, the title invokes a parallel with the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And here I've borrowed a slide from the internet, which nicely captures what this is about, right? The contrast between the Jesus of history, the actual historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, as historical method can reconstruct him, and the Christ of faith, the figure of Jesus as the central figure of Christian theology and faith. I won't be saying any more explicitly about this parallel in the talk to come, but if it's something that you want to return to in the discussion period, that would be welcome. What I want to do today is to make the case for the historical Mendel, as I'm calling him, the Mendel of history, as the Mendel whose bicentennial we should be celebrating. That is to say, the brilliant experimentalist theorist of plant hybrids, born in 1822, died in 1884. But I also want to acknowledge and reflect a little bit on how challenging that case can be, given the standing of the ahistorical Mendel, the textbook Mendel, the Mendel of faith in our science and in our culture. And I'm going to proceed in 4 steps. Firstly, take a very brief look at the ahistorical Mendel. Secondly, a longer but still way too brief look at the historical Mendel, with some comments along the way on what's so interesting and inspiring about him, at least as I see it, and why he compares well to the ahistorical Mendel. I'm then going to turn in the latter part of the talk to offer 4 anecdotes on the challenge posed by taking the historical Mendel seriously, because I think it can be difficult to absorb. And then, time permitting, I'll end with a coda, looking back at the last great Mendel anniversary, the sesquicentennial of the Versuche. So first, a very brief look at the ahistorical Mendel, the Mendel of the textbooks, the Mendel of faith. And I can be so brief here because, of course, he's so familiar to us. This is Mendel the founder of genetics, Mendel the lawgiver, who gave us the laws of inheritance from which all else has flowed in our science of inheritance, right through to CRISPR and no doubt beyond. You don't have to wait until you get to formal education in order to learn about that Mendel. I've got here a page from a Horrible Science annual that my kids got. The book is called Horrible Science. It's a very good book. But you see here the Mendel story played for laughs. He's ladling out pea soup in the canteen, as Blanca showed us, and he says, "There's no peas for the wicked." But even here we see at the bottom, it's emphasized that what Mendel discovered were what we now call the genes. Genic inheritance is what Mendel found the laws for. And that conjunction of Mendel, inheritance, genes carries right on through to the iconography for this year's celebrations. This is a poster from the Brno meeting just passed. So let me give you the headlines as I see them about the ahistorical Mendel. He is the great begetter. He is the great begetter of the laws, principles of genic inheritance, and so of the science founded on those laws, and then everything subsequently learned about genes. And there's a sense in which he doesn't really belong to his historical moment in an ordinary way. And thus his work is often described as decades ahead of his time, right? Which is why in his own lifetime, he was not hailed as a great begetter. We just saw some of this in the superb film that Blanca just shared. So that's all I wanted to say about the ahistorical Mendel, right? He's so familiar to us. Much less familiar to many of us anyway is the historical Mendel, by which I mean the Mendel increasingly known to historians of science. And I now want to turn to that Mendel and make some comments as well on what I think is so interesting and also inspiring about him, and indeed why he compares well to the ahistorical Mendel, why he's an appropriate figure for bicentennial celebration. So let me give you the headline straight off for the historical Mendel. He didn't see himself as putting the science of inheritance on a new genic basis. This touches on a question from the last talk. Rather, he saw himself as having discovered and explained the law governing an interesting class of hybrid plants. That law, by the way, not being the law of segregation, not being the law of independent assortment, but A plus 2AA plus A. That's the law valid for Pisum. Furthermore, his contemporaries understood the Versuche in that spirit, the spirit in which Mendel offered it, right, as having done a really classy job on one class of hybrid plants. And when we see that there's no delayed reception historical problem, right? How could it be that Mendel founded the science of genetics in 1865 in those lectures, only nobody noticed? Bob Olby called that a pseudo problem, right? Because when the problem goes away once we understand what questions Mendel was actually addressing and how that was understood at the time. I'm going to focus now on what I've said about Mendel's own ambitions in the paper, unpack that a little bit, because I think it's really important. And one good way in is to take his title seriously, right? Experiments on plant hybrids, not on inheritance. Inheritance barely comes up in the paper. The term comes up once and in passing. He tells us that his aim is to find a generally applicable law governing the formation and development of hybrids. So his question is not, how does inheritance work, right? So his question is not, how can hybrids be used as a means to the end of understanding something else, something grander, right? Inheritance. But rather, what is the law governing variable as distinct from constant hybrids? And what accounts for that law causally? So here we have a question in which hybrids are treated as ends unto themselves. That's what Mendel wants to understand, hybrids, one particular kind of hybrids. And I want to pause here to say a little bit about that world that Blanca evoked so vividly, the Abbey world of practical science, because to my mind, it has an ambiguous bearing on this interpretive question of what Mendel's paper is about, right? Heredity or hybrids, because it's often treated as though the immersion in that world of practical science of and by itself determines what Mendel's paper had to be about. It had to be about inheritance, but it doesn't. Blanca's already shown us this lovely picture. There's Mendel there holding a flower, the fuchsia, for which he was esteemed as a breeder in Brunn and the wider region. So for Mendel in his world, hybrids of and for themselves were economically important as well as scientifically fascinating. We see there Abbot Knapp sitting just beside Mendel. And the view that Mendel's paper is about inheritance comes with a backstory in which Knapp features centrally. And I don't mean to pick on Simon Maurer's book. It's a wonderful book, beautifully written, which is partly why I'm sharing it. But we find here the standard backstory related in Maurer's book. And it's to do with a meeting of the sheep breeders in 1837. As Maurer says, Knapp's interest, right, in sheep breeding was both scientific and commercial. More than 50% of the convent's income was through the wool trade, but above all, it was enthusiastic. They argued around and around these worthy men. They were farmers, breeders, mill owners, and textile magnates. There was much confused talk, but occasional clarity shone through. It was Abbot Knapp himself who declared, his words are reported in the minutes of one meeting in 1837, the question for discussion should not be the theory and process of breeding, but what is inherited and how, right? That's the talk, the title for the talk that Eva's going to be giving a little bit later. So he puts that question, it's in the transcript. 6 years later, after he had set the agenda, it was Cyril Knapp himself who welcomed Gregor Mendel. It would be Mendel who takes up the Abbott's challenge. Right, so this is the backstory. Knapp sets the question, what is inherited and how, gets Mendel to take it up. Mendel answers the question, genes are inherited and they do not change when brought together in the hybrid. The problem with this backstory is that it's retrospective. Right? The question that Knapp posed at that meeting, as recorded in that transcript, stands out to us in hindsight if we suppose that Mendel's paper is about inheritance, but otherwise it didn't stand out at all. What we need is a contemporary kind of litmus test to help us figure out, is Mendel's paper about hybrids, as it seems to be, or is it actually about inheritance? And to my mind, an excellent litmus test exists in the form of the copy of The Origin of Species that Blanca mentioned, the copy held in the Abbey, full of Mendel's annotations. It's very instructive to have a look and see what about the topics that Darwin covered got Mendel's pencil going. In chapter 1 of The Origin of Species, Darwin has an explicit discussion about inheritance. It attracted no annotations at all from Gregor Mendel. Most of his annotations are on the chapter about hybrids. There are a few exceptions, but they're all in keeping with Mendel's quite focused interests on the things that he writes about in the Versuche. So in chapter 1 of The Origin, Darwin writes about his belief that domesticated organisms were far more variable than wild organisms. Mendel was seriously annoyed by that aspect of Darwin's book, wrote about that in his annotations, and in the Versuche, he makes some rather tart remarks about how anyone could ever have thought that species become more variable under domestication. But again, the section on inheritance, nothing. So in my view, being historical about Mendel in part means taking seriously what his question was. And his question was not, how does inheritance work, right? Hybrids as means to that end, but rather, what is the law governing variable as distinct from constant hybrids, and what accounts for that law? So hybrids as ends unto themselves. Now, this distinction between variable and constant hybrids is not familiar anymore, so let me touch on it. And I just want to say in passing, it's an Austro-Hungarian question, as Sandra Gliboff put it. And it seems as though Barbara is going to be touching on that in her talk to come about Mendel and the University of Vienna. So first, constant hybrids, what are they? So we've got two species, two varieties, you cross them, and the offspring has this new character, and it's a really exciting character. And you hope that in allowing that plant to self-fertilize, the hybrid character carries on, whoops, and it does. So that's a constant hybrid. Oh, there we go. Right, so the hybrid character, the attractive character carries on. And then there are the variable hybrids. In this case, you breed together A and B, you get a plant with attractive character C, you self-fertilize, fingers crossed, but now the old parental character comes back. That's what Mendel's paper is about. To touch on a question Eva asked, the Hawkweed's paper was about constant hybrids. That's where Mendel went next. But the P paper, the Versuche, is about variable hybrids, hybrids in which the hybrid character does not stay constant, but gets broken up. Is there a law that governs those hybrids? And if there is a law, what is its explanation? That's what Mendel's paper is about. And when we appreciate that, we begin to see the remarks he makes about cell theory in a new light. Towards the end of the paper, he tells us the attribution attempted here of the essential difference in the development of hybrids is to a permanent or temporary union of the differing cell elements. right? So sometimes the differing cell elements come together in a permanent union, in the case of the constant hybrids. Sometimes they come together in a temporary union, and that's in the case of the variable hybrids. And he really was fascinated by and right up to date in his knowledge of the cell theory of the day. And the only footnote in the paper is a long footnote on the empirically vindicated causal equivalence of the egg cell and the pollen cell, right? For Mendel, the egg cell is not a kind of nurse, right? There is no effect on the results, which one was the seed parent, which one was the pollen parent. So we take his title seriously. We take his remarks on cell theory seriously. We also, I think, need to take his notation seriously, because Mendel writes, and the film was a little naughty here, A for the true breeding plants, where the modern geneticist would write AA. And as Bob Olby and others argued, I think convincingly, uh, there's just no evidence for reading an atomic or genic conception of the underlying cellular material into the paper. And one can read the paper without making that presumption. For example, by supposing that what Mendel maybe had in mind were reversibly mixing fluids like oil and water, right? So we've got big A stuff and little a stuff. They come together in the hybrid, and temporarily they're in union, right, with one of the stuffs making the visible character. But then when gametes are produced, they unmix and move separately into the different gametes. That's a model which is certainly consistent with everything that we actually read in the paper when we're not back projecting from the Mendelism that followed. So that's a very brief introduction to the Versuche read historically. I think it's fascinating, right? Because among other things, we see that the paper is about something that mattered in Mendel's world, but doesn't in ours, right? Variable hybrids. And in explaining the law governing those hybrids, it touches on something familiar to us, but in a surprising way, cell theory. And furthermore, that cellular explanation doesn't appear to be at all genic, but it works beautifully on its own terms. And I don't have time to go into this, but another feature of the paper that I think really comes through when you try to tune in to what's really on Mendel's mind is the way he makes that law, A plus 2AA plus A, kind of dance mathematically. So I think it's a fascinating paper, read not as our textbooks encourage to read it, but read kind of in its own time. I think it's also inspiring because in my view, in the way of all great science, Mendel in the experiments underpinning the paper is simultaneously in dialogue with the past, with his predecessors, with the present, that world that Blanca evoked of the abbey as a kind of scientific seminar, and also with the future, because he was very ambitious scientifically. I really do think Mendel's paper is one of the great papers, and it's great in the way that great science is always great. I actually put this case in check when I was invited to speak at the unveiling of a new statue to Mendel that was unveiled at Mendel University in Brno in 2017. And my remarks are included in an edition of the paper that you can find on sale at the Mendel Museum. So I think it's really interesting. I think it's inspiring. I also think the historical Mendel compares well with the ahistorical Mendel. First, because he was real, and it's good to celebrate someone who is real rather than a figment of the Mendelian imagination. But also because we appreciate that the reason he concentrated at the start on either or uniform characters caused by nothing other than associated cellular material was because he was interested in tracking the fate of hybrid characters. Those choices make sense in the light of that goal. By contrast, those same choices, construed as starting points for understanding inheritance, have been and remain very problematic. Now, this was pointed out 2 years after the rediscovery that we heard about by the English biologist Walter Frank Raphael Weldon. You see him there. He published a critical article in which he included this photograph. If you just look at the top row, we see that Peas studied by other people don't necessarily look the way that we expect given Mendel's paper. Yes, in box number 1, we see really green peas, and box number 6, we see really yellow peas, but in between, we see a spectrum. And Weldon went on from that opening to develop his own thoughts on inheritance and what a better starting point might be. And I just want to mention a popular address he gave in Belfast that same year, a little bit later on. Early on, he discusses an experimental study of the growth of the spine in the water flea Daphnia. If you raise Daphnia in overcrowded water, you'll produce spineless Daphnia generation after generation, he tells his audience. But if you remove one of the spineless individuals to pure water, its descendants will grow up to have a long spine. Here's the take home for Weldon. Now, clearly the condition of the spine is not exclusively acquired and it is not exclusively inherited. It belongs to both categories. A Daphnia of certain ancestry, we would say genetic background, growing in a solution of certain chemical composition has a spine of a certain length. You cannot assert that either factor is more essential than the other. For if the Daphnia remain the same, you can change the result by changing the solution. Well, if the solution remain the same, you can, within considerable limits, change the result by changing the Daphnia. We see here the complex way in which the characters of an organism are determined by the interaction of the two sets of factors, the environmental and the ancestral. For Weldon, that's the big picture about inheritance in the early 20th century. That vision, some years later, gets translated into the first norm of reaction graphs, also using Daphnia, by Richard Volterek in 1909. On Weldon's understanding of inheritance, that should be what we think about when we think about inheritance. Yes, Mendel's results and his laws have their place, right? It's represented by Punnett squares, but they are the exceptions. They're special cases. They aren't the great generalizations on which to hang everything else. The great generalization is that a bit of chromosome, which Weldon already thought was probably the cellular basis for inheritance. A bit of chromosome has different effects on a body given contexts, internal and external. That for Weldon should be the big picture about inheritance. And Weldon features in a big way in the book that Lynn kindly mentioned. It's not out yet, it will be out next year, about the debate over Mendel's paper that broke out after that rediscovery in 1900. And I write quite a lot in the book about the legacies of that debate and the fact that the Mendelians won it. We'll be hearing much more about some of these topics in the symposium to come, so I'll be very brief now, but I look at the legacies of Mendelism for eugenics. The eugenic bandwagon would have rolled, of course, without Mendelism, but Mendelism, I think, greased the wheels. Amir Teicher will be talking more about this shortly. The legacies of Mendelism for science education. On my own trip to the new exhibition hall that Blanca mentioned, I took a photograph of this slide from the end. So it is a wonderful exhibition, but at the end we learn about polygenic inheritance and environmental effects. Under polygenic inheritance, we learn that when polygenic inheritance means that a given phenotype is coded by multiple genes. This is the case for the vast majority of traits, which makes their heredity a very complicated matter. Just below, we learn you're no doubt notice that if you don't water a plant with genes for tall height, those genes won't be enough to make it tall. The environment has a powerful effect on how our genes are expressed and produces even greater variability throughout populations. So those points are made about how inheritance works in general, but they're made at the very end. And I'm among those who are concerned that a genetics education which gives students in the first instance examples in which we get those simple either or binary characters and explanations which touch on nothing other than genes, gives them a false impression about how inheritance works and sets them up for an overly determinist attitude to genes. But you'll be hearing again more about this in the talks from Kostas Kamparakis and Brian Donovan, Lynn, and others. In the book, I'm especially exercised by what it means historically for science that Mendelism, rather than other options that were available in the early 20th century, came to be at the center of our ways of thinking about inheritance and how it works. And the book explores alternative paths. What if Weldon had lived beyond 1906 when he died suddenly, had actually managed to publish the masterwork that he was working on at the time of his death? How might we now think differently about inheritance? Might we all now take for granted that rather than genes being thought of as these invisible string pullers, right, which determine how our bodies grow and how our lives go, we all take for granted that genes have variable effects depending on context, internal and external. That's explored in the book. So you can see why I'm excited about the prospect of liberating ourselves from the ahistorical Mendel and instead embracing the historical Mendel. But not everybody looks like that. And I realize that I'm near the end of my time, very quickly to just offer a few anecdotes which seem to me illuminating about the challenge posed by seeing things the way that I do, right? Embracing the historical Mendel. And these are all anecdotes from this anniversary year, the bicentennial year. First, 19th of July, 2022, Nature published an editorial about Mendel, right? Just on time for his birthday. And we learned there that new historical sources have vindicated the view, and it's quoted there at the end, that viewed in the light of what was known of cells in the mid-19th century, Mendel was, there it is again, decades ahead of his time. If you go to have a look at the paper published in a perspective article in Nature Genetics, what you find is that the new historicals discovered through internet searching are very interesting. They do throw new light on one of Mendel's contacts in the world of cell theory, on his immersion in the world of practical breeding, but they don't actually touch at all on those interpretive questions that I introduced you to a little while ago. So that's a little disappointing, and a little disappointing too that the news that Mendel had been shown historically to be decades ahead of his time went rapidly around the world. Second anecdote, I was there at the Brno meeting, and to my amazement, one of the keynote speakers put up a slide about Bob Olby's claim that the delayed reception of Mendel's 66 paper was a pseudo problem. In the speaker's view, it wasn't a pseudo problem at all. There was a real problem. The problem was that everyone around Mendel was lazy and complacent. And it was left to me to try to explain that I felt that Olby's claim there had been misunderstood. I should mention, by the way, that Olby passed away at the end of 2020. As I was there at that meeting in Brno, friends of mine at another meeting in England told me that their kind remarks about my talk seemed to have provoked a discussion among pea geneticists who were present, some of whom began to suggest that maybe the University of Chicago Press would want to rethink the cover of my book, because plainly Weldon had forgotten to take off the seed coats from his seeds. But if you look at the paper, it's plain that that's just not so. It was very important indeed to Weldon that the seed coats be removed. And indeed, the bottom of the image, he means to show you how different cotyledon color can be from seed coat color. So I was a little taken aback by this response to the cover. And to go back to my title, just a little feeling of perhaps a heresy being suppressed here. So I don't want, however, to leave you with the notion that my experience anyway of the bicentennial year has all been of this form. I want to close by sharing with you a testimonial from a colleague of mine at the University of Leeds who contacted me last year, having heard me speak about these topics some years back, to join him in teaching introductory genetics in a fresh new way, which is what we did. And to my amazement, when it was my turn to speak, he said the following to the students, and I'm going to close with his testimonial. His name is Tom Bennett. Here's what he said to the students. When I first came to Leeds in 2015-16, I saw Greg give a talk on his research into the history of genetics and also his ideas about the teaching of genetics, which were very different to how I'd been taught genetics and how I thought about genetics. And his talk really challenged my views. Why did it challenge my beliefs? Mostly because Mendelian genetics is a thing that I've been doing since I was at university as an undergraduate during my level 3 project. A lot of what I did in my PhD was just Mendelian genetics. I've spent huge swathes of my life crossing things together and looking at the segregation ratios that result and working out what things are double mutant, et cetera. And so for someone to tell me that Mendelian genetics is not very important really kind of frightened me. Yes, it is. How dare you? And what I've spent the past 5 years doing on and off is trying to digest that and understand how two people talking about the same thing can have such a different viewpoint on it and what that means and how you reconcile these viewpoints. But I actually think he's basically right, Tom said to the students. So we've tried to design the content of this module around thinking about genetics teaching differently and trying to really understand how inheritance works, rather than simply saying there's this Mendelian genetics and this is how it works, and then there are all these exceptions, which is a very unsatisfying way of doing things. The point I'm trying to make here is that at university, you are often challenged by things, and that's a good thing. And that's really one of the things that we want you to take away, that there is no one correct way of thinking about things, that there is always scope to re-examine things and try to understand them from a different perspective. And I'd like to think that Mendel, such a brilliant teacher, such a great student, would have not just appreciated, but endorsed that message in his bicentennial year. And on that note, I'll end. Thank you very much.